I'd like to thank you all for coming out for the local perspectives on the concussion issue for this breakout session. Our speakers today are going to be Mr. Ned Sparks and Josh Greenfield will be filling in Hannah Carden. And I believe Sparks would like to start us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. If you don't mind, I'm sort of the old school teacher in me. I'd like to just kind of stand and talk to you and kind of make it a little bit informal as we go along here. Let me just tell you who I am and who I work with and all the things that are involved with that. My name is Ned Sparks. For the last, I hate to admit this, 33 years, I've been the executive director of the Maryland Public Secondary Schools Athletic Association. Now what's that? That's the High School Athletic Association. Every state in the union has a high school athletic association. All right, there's the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Association, there's the Virginia High School League. Every state has an association. The association in Maryland is a little bit different than most of the other states in that our association gets its authority from the local school systems and the Maryland State Department of Education, State Superintendent of Schools. There is a master agreement in place, and basically it's an agreement between the local school systems and the State Department of Education. It's all, you want to call it a marriage, and the child of that marriage is the MPSSAA, the Maryland Public Secondary Schools Athletic Association. So we get our authority from the local school systems and the State Department of Education. We are unlike most other high school athletic associations in that we are tied in directly with the State Department of Education. I work for the State Superintendent of Schools. I happen to be that they appoint the executive director of the association. So the High School Athletic Association in Maryland is a quasi-public organization, unlike just about every other state. And in those states, the High School Athletic Association are private entities, similar to what you might think of when you think of the NCAA. It's a private entity. The associations in most other states are private organizations. The association in Maryland, Delaware, and Texas, all right, are associations that are tied in with the State Department of Education, or in the case of Texas, the state university system. All right, so that gives you a little bit of a background of where we are. We have 198 schools, public schools within the state of Maryland that participate in interscholastic athletics. Last year we had 119,000 student athletes participate, 9,000 coaches, 7,000 officials, and probably the most prominent thing that we do, the thing that gets most of the attention, is we conduct the state championships, the state tournaments. As a matter of fact, this weekend I'm going to leave here right from here and go down to the University of Maryland. Our state wrestling championship is underway, and we'll do that for tonight and through all day tomorrow, and Crown Wrestling Championship, tomorrow night. Next weekend we'll do the boys and girls basketball championships. The boys at Comcast Center, the girls at the CQ Arena at Towson State. Probably the most visible thing that we do are those things. Sometimes we get in the press and the papers and so forth because we have challenges to our rules, and people want to take us to court over different issues. For example, eligibility, age, eligibility, number of semesters you participate, things like that and so forth. And when we're challenged with that, certainly we have to respond in those cases. Now, concussion legislation came in 2011. All right, the state legislature passed the concussion bills in 2011, and basically it required that coaches receive awareness training, that school personnel receive awareness training, that students and parents receive information regarding concussions prior to the beginning of playing interscholastic athletics in public schools in Maryland. There was also a couple of other things in there regarding concussions, regarding, for example, youth groups that use school facilities needed to assure the schools that they had some concussion awareness programs in place and so forth. But for the main part of that bill was basically on the school concussion issues. And there needed to be ways to verify the coaches had training. There needed to be ways to verify that the students and the parents had to receive their information and so forth. And so I passed out some information, or we got handed some information, and you do have a couple examples of some of those things. I think the first one on the first sheet talks about just simply the form that students sign, the form that parents sign saying, hey, we've been given this information and we acknowledge that we know that there are some dangers involved in interscholastic athletics. We know that there's some dangers involved with concussions, and we know that if we don't necessarily take care of some of these issues, there could be serious consequences to come about. So that was one of the first things, and that was kind of to make assurances that we knew exactly how the students and parents and so forth were informed. The second one was requiring the coaches, and this is something that all of our school systems have done individually, but all of our school systems have required the coaches to show this form, all right, this certificate, that they have completed a concussion awareness program. Fortunately, that concussion awareness program is given free, it's online, and I think the last I heard is about 2 million people across the country have taken that concussion awareness program. It's put out through the National Federation of High School Associations. We are a member, all right, as of all the state associations across the country, and that's something that's probably one of the most valuable things that they have done in the last few years is to provide that free course. We encourage parents to take it, we encourage other people to take it and so forth, so it's a very valuable course and something. But also our coaches are required to, before they step on the field, and this was as of the school year 2011-2012, they were required to show proof that they had completed this particular course. So that's there, and that's something that all of our coaches and all of our folks in the schools certainly need to take care of. The other form talks about is just simply a pre-participation head and injury concussion reporting form. This is for students that are playing for the first time, or students playing, every year for that matter. But obviously, you can get concussions outside of interscholastic athletics. You can get concussions riding skateboards. You can get concussions, horsing around. You can get concussions on a bicycle accident. There are many different things. And this is important to know, all right, from a point of view, from the physician's point of view, that these kind of things have happened in the past, and the student has a history of these concussions and so forth. And so as a result, this was put into place, and we have this particular form for the students to at least alert their schools that they have had this particular issue in the past. The next form really is probably one of the key forms, and that is what happens when the student has had a concussion. And that's probably probably the most important thing. And I look over here and I see, Dr. Kevin Crutchfield, who is a member of our traumatic brain injury task force and has certainly been a very valuable source and so forth. And I'm sure he could probably tell you a lot better than I can regarding what happens, what they call the second impact syndrome. All right, the first might have had a concussion and so forth. You think you're okay. There's no other visible signs and so forth. Student goes back in before they're had a chance to heal completely, have that second impact, that second concussion, and there could be some very serious ramifications, even to the point of even in some cases death. All right, that second impact syndrome. What we wanted to do, and what we were collaborated with and so forth with the experts that we were able to gather from across the state, what we wanted to be able to do was to provide a way to assure that no student return to competition prior to being completely healed. You turn your ankle and your ankle swells up, and the swelling goes down, you're healed. But you get a injury in your head and so forth, there's real no visible signs. And so obviously there needed to be some kind of criteria, some kind of format and so forth that we were able to impose here. So this particular form talks about what happens when a student has suspected of concussion. All right. Now, what's suspected of concussion? I gave you a little refrigerator magnet there, and those are some of the signs and symptoms of that. We did that in 2010. Handed those out. Wanted to figure out a way. What way could we send something home to the parents that they would be able to keep, have ready, and when they needed it, be able to consult it. You send a piece of paper home with a student in high school. The chances of it getting home are probably about 1 in 25 or so. So we wanted to put something that would be memorable, and they would remember where it was and so forth. Well, where do you keep stuff you want to know the phone number for? You keep it on your refrigerator, right? Your refrigerator magnet you know, the pizza delivery, the poison control, the number you call when the gas and electric is out, you know, all those kind of things. You know, you just know where to go, where to look, and so forth. So we passed those out. One of the interesting things about that was we ordered 10,000 of those things, put them, 10,000, figure we're going to send them to the, put them in the hands of parents of those of students that played the sports that were most likely to have concussions, the footballs, the lacrosse, the wrestlings, and things like that, and so forth. What we didn't realize, I ordered 10,000 of them. Do you know how much 10,000 of these things weigh? Tons. They have an office in the 6th floor of the State Department of Education, you know. So you can imagine what we had to do that summer to get those out of there and so forth, but it was an interesting thing. Anyways, getting a little off the subject, but anyways, we ordered those things. These are some of the symptoms. These are the things we look for, all right? And who should need to look for it? Well, we know that our coaches have been trained in it. We know that maybe our parents have been trained in it. We know that maybe the students have been trained in it, at least informed in that. And we even know the students themselves have been trained in it. Not to mention, if a school is lucky enough to have a trainer, you know, certainly, obviously, they have a better understanding and a better ability to do that. But we wanted to be able to put that in the hands so that everybody could kind of recognize and know what is a concussion, what are the signs and symptoms of a concussion. And should that occur, pull that student out. Let that student sit and have that student evaluated. And if that student is referred, that student needs to be evaluated. Now, this is one of the problems, and Dr. Crutchfield, I'm sure, can bear me out with this. One of the issues that we've had with this whole thing, and, you know, pardon the pun, the Achilles heel, so to speak, has been the qualifications of physicians, all right, to recognize and to distinguish concussions and the seriousness of them. If a school is lucky enough to have a doctor, you know, you're lucky enough to have a team doctor in the school, chances are that physician is probably an orthopod, right? Don't have a lot of experience in concussions. All right? We found out that the pediatricians, up until probably just recently, haven't had much experience in that. We know that many of our students, if they sustain an injury and are told they need to see a doctor, they might go to the walk-in clinic. Those people don't have a whole lot of experience in that. And that was one of the major issues that we're still working through, as a matter of fact, and still trying to find a way that which, when they're, you know, continuing education and things like that and so forth, we can get to those positions and say, hey, here are some issues in that. There is no certification process to certify a physician in concussion awareness, concussion training, concussion certification, things of that, and so forth. So it's kind of one of the things where, you know, they pass a law and they tell you need a physician to declare you if you had a concussion or not and send you back into play. But the devil now becomes in the details when we find out that the physicians might not necessarily be as informed and be as able to do that as you would think they would, but not necessarily, because obviously everybody has their own avenue of specialty. So this is one of the key forms in regard to what happens to the student. The student has been diagnosed, no concussion, probably can return to play, or so forth, but has been a concussion. Then, once the student has been declared eligible to get back and ready to play, there is a 6-step process, and that's really what's on the next several pages. And that's basically a return to play process. In other words, the doctor just didn't say, you're good to go back in the game, you know, or you're good to go, you can start practicing tomorrow, you're good to go, you can play next week, and so forth. There has to be a process, a protocol, and this is the protocol that's met. If you look through that, you can see it starts out very light exercise from stationary bike and some light jogging and things like that. Once you progress through that, the next step, and sometimes people get in the fall into the trap saying, well, the next day. Well, no, not the next day. Once you progress past one and you get to the next stage, and you complete that stage, it could be the next day, but it might be 2 days later, it might be 3 days later. If you can't complete that stage, you stay there until you do complete that stage. All right, and so as a result, it's probably a period of time of anywhere from 6 days or beyond at the best for a student to get back into play after the physician after it has declared that person ready to play. So there's a long, drawn-out process, and this process is in place for the 119,000 students that participate in our schools, every year. And it's something that is not perfect. We'll certainly admit to that, but it's certainly a lot better than it was 5 years ago, and a heck of a lot better than it was 10 years ago. And we was talking to some of the people here, some of the young people here, what would they have done when they were participating in athletics and so forth. How many times you got knocked out, and how many times you came back, and things like that, and so forth. And I know myself. I participated in football at the high school and college level. I can think of 3 times I was knocked out cold. By today's standards, maybe people say, "Well, that's why I know what's wrong with that guy," But nevertheless, I do know that the protocol is so much more different than it was, back in those days and so forth. And the days of coming up and rubbing the smelling salts underneath the nose, and getting them back up, good to go, and so forth, is certainly long gone. And thank goodness it is, because then we can avoid some tragic things from happening. Nevertheless, there is a process, and I just want to kind of point out to you these forms and these things that are in place now within the school system, in the public schools and across Maryland. Our State Board of Education also became very interested, and besides having the law, they wanted to put these things into regulation. Now, kind of a duplication, if you might think, but nevertheless, they did. And so we spent another year going back and looking at some of the things that we probably were left out of the law and needed to be put back in regarding treatment and regarding incidents for concussions. For example, one of the things that is not in the law, but certainly thought was really needed and was put in the regulations, was academic accommodations for students. All right, and so as a result, we wanted to make sure that the school nurse, who might not be in the picture, right? The school nurse, something happens on the ball field after school, all right, he was referred to the physician, and then necessarily might come back to school. The school nurse might not know about it, the teachers might not know about it, and so forth. And so as a result, we wanted to be able to make academic accommodations for students in that regard. They not only return to play, but also the comment was return to learn, all right? And we do know that there was some times when students suffering concussions and so forth had some slowness in learning and had obviously some needs that were probably not in their normal function. So we added some appropriate academic accommodations. We also added some notification procedures. But perhaps the most significant one, and that's there in the paper handout that you have, and you see with the press release there, and that was the regulation. And I'll just read it to you real quickly. But it said, by August 1st, 2013, which was just 6 months ago, I guess, or so, the MPSSAA, that's the Maryland Public Secondary School Athletic Association, in collaboration with appropriate medical, academic, and athletic advisory team, will identify collision and contact sports and prescribe limitations for full contact experiences in these sports. In other words, we're going to make a recommendation. We're going to identify what are collision sports, what are contact sports, what are limited contact sports, what are non-contact sports. We're going to limit those. We're going to identify those sports. And then we're going to make recommendations for limiting contact in those sports. All right. One of the things that we know that there's studies out there now. Of course, the jury is still out on a lot of this kind of stuff, but we know there are studies out there limiting the amount of contact, limiting the amount of exposures, limiting the amount of time of live blocking and tackling in football, for that matter, for body checking in lacrosse, for that matter, for checking and so forth in ice hockey. All right. We know that there are studies out there, and we know that that information seems to be the wave of where things are going, limiting those number of contacts, limiting those number of exposures. And so we identified different sports, and if you turn over that first page there, I think, we identified those sports, and we said that the collision sports were football, ice hockey, and boys lacrosse. And we said that the contact sports, and we identified them, athletes routinely make contact with each other or inanimate objects, but usually with less force than in collision sports, or basketball, boys and girls basketball, field hockey, girls lacrosse, soccer, and wrestling. And then we said the limited contact sports were sports like baseball, although there is, not contact a lot, but there is contact. There's plays at the plate, there's plays on base pads, there's getting hit by a pitch, there's the kind of things that can happen and so forth. There's limited contact. Some of the field events in track and field like high jump and pole vault, softball and volleyball. And then there's the non-contact sports. The non-contact sports, which you don't expect to have contact. It might happen, but you don't expect to have contact in swimming. But I guess a youngster could slip on the deck, and have contact. You don't expect to have contact in bowling and golf and things like that, but those kind of things, might necessarily happen. And then they made recommendations on limiting contact in those sports. And for football, and probably the most notable one of all, for football, it was made the recommendation and put into effect for this year that our schools will have contact, live contact. Now, what do we mean by live contact? We mean tackle to the ground, all right? If you think about football, when you get down to the very basics of football is to knock somebody off their feet, right? That's as basic as it gets. Knock somebody off their feet, knock them to the ground, all right? So they said that we should limit the contact to 2 days a week in practice and one day in a game situation. So limit it from what potentially could have been 6 or 7 days a week, right, every day, to being half of that, 3 days a week, 2 days of practice and one game of a contest. Now, the truth be known, probably most of our good coaches weren't doing that anyways. Most of our good coaches, and as the season went on, would begin to slack off and take, not get as much contact as the season went on. But nevertheless, all right, sometimes you need to put those rules in for the least common denominator as opposed to the better coaches. So that was put into place. We're getting into the boys lacrosse season now coming up. They've started their practice already as of Saturday, if they can get out on their fields. And we've said now that boys they shouldn't do, the recommendation, they shouldn't do live body checking the day before a game. Now, why the day before a game? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this regard. We know that you can play 14 games. So if you did the day before a game, that'd be 14 practices. That was probably the best way to do it because a lot of our teams sometimes play 2 games a week, sometimes they play 3 games a week, and to try and figure out who's who and how many games you played, and when you played, you can have checking in practice and not practice and so on and so forth. We just simply said the day before a game, you have 14 games, that's 14 practices, that you would limit the amount of contact, body checking and so forth prior to a contest. So, having said that, we also have ice hockey. In Maryland, we have one public school that has ice hockey. One public school. And it's on the Eastern Shore, all right, and they play all the teams from Delaware. So really haven't done much with ice hockey because, quite frankly, I don't know if we're very, very sophisticated or know a whole lot about ice hockey, but nevertheless, we haven't gotten to write any recommendations in that regard. In the other sports, we talked about drills, we talked about things. One of the biggest things is soccer. And we do know that, say, for example, that one of the major injury for girls in soccer is the sport of soccer. And we try to do some information and try to find out some things, talk to people like the NCAA folks have been studying that pretty carefully and pretty closely and try to find out what was it. And I think that, the common things people think is, well, it's girls of slight in stature, heading the ball and things of that nature. No, that wasn't really the case. The case was what they refer to as aerial challenges, where two players are off the ground, all right, have no control over where they're going to come down and so forth, bump each other, hit their head on someone's knee, hit their head on the ground, things like that, so forth and so on. This is probably the greatest sense of injuries. But we don't have a real good handle on all that right now. And those are the kind of things that they're studying over the course of time, and hopefully we'll get a better handle on it. But right now, we just simply said you should limit the kind of drills you do in regard to aerial challenges and things of that nature, simply because that has a greater incidence of injury. So probably the most significant thing that came out as a result of all this concussion thing, other than the coaches being trained and everybody being informed, that's certainly important. But what is probably more important is we've actually put a limit on the amount of contact that schools can have, the amount of contact that they can have in different sports, and something that we think will probably go a long way in reducing that. One of the other things that you probably can imagine is once people became aware of concussions, because they really weren't that aware of it in the past and so forth, we found out that there was a lot more reported. So sometimes the statistics will be somewhat a little bit deceiving in that all of a sudden we have an epidemic of concussions where we probably had them anyways, but now we're getting them reported and getting them looked into and getting people to recognize some of the things that are involved with that. I don't have any more. Kevin, I don't know if I missed anything. Kevin has been with our traumatic brain injury group since it started. He's also a member of our sports medicine advisory group for the MPSSAA, and certainly a very valuable asset. And it was people like him and his colleagues and so forth that we rely heavily on, because we're educators, athletes, and things like that, and certainly we need that kind of expertise to try and point us in the right direction and tell us the things that, hey, what you've been doing is wrong, or what you've been doing is not quite, what's in the best interest of youngsters and so forth. So we do appreciate the things that they do. I don't know what the format is, whether you want to open for questions or you want to let
Let's let
okay.
Greenfield go, and then we'll do a quick
sure.
question and answer.
I won't be too long. I'd much rather answer questions than talk. But I'm Delegate Cardin's Legislative Director, Chief of Staff. Been with him for about 2 years. And in the 2 years that I've been with him, we've had 2 issues that have come up that sort of deal with concussions and head injuries. And I guess I want to start out with a quick story about just how charged this issue is, that I don't think any of us really, we in my office didn't realize until last year that this is such a sensitive issue to so many people. Last year we had a constituent who has young girls and coaches lacrosse, girls lacrosse, come to us and say, I'm really worried about head injuries, whether they're lacerations, fractures, concussions, all these things. I think we should look into having girls wear helmets like we do for guys in lacrosse. And we said, okay, that sounds like a reasonable enough idea. So we put in legislation. It was actually Delegate Dana Stein, who's in my boss's district, and we were the only 2 co-sponsors or sponsors of this bill. And I guess because Delegate Cardin has a name that's before Delegate Stein's alphabetically, everybody thought it was our bill. It wasn't our bill, but anyway, the bill drops and we get hundreds, maybe even thousands of phone calls on this bill, and most people are adamantly opposed. They say female lacrosse is a beautiful, elegant game, and there isn't any contact, and why are you trying to mess with our game? You said delusional. It seems that way to me. I've seen female lacrosse. That's not what I saw. I did not a lacrosse player, so maybe I'm wrong. But it was really interesting to see all of these people get so charged up about it. All the issues that we cover, death penalty, minimum wage, guns. Guns people get really into, but after guns, this was the issue last year we heard the most about, and the opposition was just vociferous. And there was this weird divide, too, between the administration folks and sort of the establishment folks, and then the people on the ground, whether they're parents or parents that are coaching, that are seeing firsthand what's going on in their sports. And the establishment administration folks were really adamantly opposed. We were going to ruin their game. And the parents said, my kid has had 2 and 3 and 4 concussions, and I'm really worried. This might be a really good idea. So there was this really strange divide. But anyway, what ultimately happened was we just took so much heat for this. This bill was not going to go anywhere because of it. we actually ended up withdrawing the bill before it had a hearing. And, you know, I don't know if there's any resolution to this issue. I've understood that U.S. Lacrosse is looking into these issues, whether girls should be wearing helmets or not. They obviously, as you probably know, wear the goggles, but should they be doing more? And I think that's an open question. And I think there is a legitimate concern that they did raise that we keep hearing over and over again. When you add more protective layers, does it make people hit harder, more violent collisions and things of that nature that actually may have the unintended consequence of making the game less safe? So that was just a really eye-opening experience. And this year, we came back with another bill, and it's another controversial bill apparently. We didn't think it would be again. But anyway, the story goes that we passed this bill that Mr. Sparks talked about in 2011, which is awesome, that we're having education and we have procedures for kids if they get hurt to come back on, to get off the field, and these types of things. But what we still have, despite an increase in reporting that Mr. Sparks talked about, we still see an underreporting of concussions. Do you know, Greg, what are the numbers on that? I know we've talked about it before. I don't recall.
53% of the kids don't say that they have concussions, but in terms of the unreporting, nobody knows.
Right. So we're really worried that kids are staying on the field, whether it's football, soccer, lacrosse, what have you, when they probably shouldn't be, because there's pressure to keep playing, to prove you're tough, to win the game, all of these things. I played sports as a kid. I know that you probably would have had to drag me off the field. So we said, what can we do to have a more objective measure to decide whether someone, you know, should come off the field or not? And fortunately, through Maryland's Technology Incubator Investment Program, we met Mr. Merrill. I think you spoke earlier, right, Greg? Mm-hmm. So I think everybody's familiar with the technology that Brain Sensory has and the impact sensors. And we started working together and said, you know, this could be a technology to bridge that gap between people that are hurt and getting them off the field and trying to understand whether they actually do have a head injury that needs more attention. As I'm sure you heard, it's not a diagnostic procedure, but it raises a flag and says to the coaches or the staff or whoever's there, this kid needs to get attention. And then we would go from there. So we put in a bill. You know, we knew the state doesn't have the money to buy, I don't know, thousands of sensors for lacrosse and football that would be probably millions of dollars that we just don't have, and the technology is still in the early stages, so you know, it would be a huge investment. So we said, how can we do this? And we came up with an idea to have a pilot program that one school in each county, so that'd be 24 schools, one football team would equip their students with these impact sensors, and the companies would be generous enough to hopefully donate them to us. And Mr. Merrill said he would do it. We've talked to other companies that said they would do it if, you know, to try and get the technology into the states and see what happens. And we would collect data on this, I guess you'd say. How many helmets had sensors that went off, and what were the results? Did they get taken off the field? Did they have a concussion? Did they return within 1 day, 2 weeks, what have you? So we thought that this bill was a no-brainer. It's not going to cost the state any money. It's going to help kids, you know, be more protected when they play these sports. And again, our phones start blowing up, and this time we're not getting opposition from people that are actually playing the sports. By and large, we got good support from coaches and from parents and athletes. We have concerns from administration folks, and this time from medical professionals, and legitimately so, that we just didn't anticipate, and these are the unintended consequences of putting in legislation, going through the process. So we have people with the athletic associations and the trainers that are concerned about mandating new technology that they maybe aren't prepared to deal with yet. And we got concerns from doctors that if we put impact sensors on helmets, we're going to catch some people the light's gonna go off, they're gonna come off the field, they're gonna have a concussion, but what if the light doesn't go off and they have a concussion, a false negative, or false positives in the reverse? The light goes off, every time somebody gets touched, they shouldn't be coming off the field that often. We don't think that's a really legitimate concern, because, you know, I've seen the technology, and I think it's when 1% of hits or something like that, give or take, you know, make the light go off. So it's not like everybody's gonna be coming off the field and you're not gonna have anybody to field a team. We wouldn't want that. That would be a really bad outcome. However, I guess if they all had concussions, maybe it wouldn't be just a bad outcome, and that would be the thing to do. So we got a lot of, and then it turns out there's a lot of competition within this community of people and companies producing impact sensors. Mr. Merrill is one, Rydell, who came and testified, the big national helmet manufacturer came in and testified. But then we had people that came in opposition based on allegedly on science and medicine, but really what we found out later is they're actually developing their own sensors. And they're just not there yet. And they said, hold on, we don't want this in the state because we're gonna get left behind. So this was just a really bizarre proceeding, and I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I don't recall the date, that we had this hearing, and we presented with our friends, Mr. Merrill and Rydell folks, and some other more local supporters, and then we had a lot of folks come up in opposition, and we're still trying to work this thing out, see if it can pass. You know, with all that opposition, it's an uphill battle, although it seems kind of like a no-brainer to us. So, you know, we've learned a lot in the last 2 years about how charged this issue is and how much farther we have to go. But, you know, it's really exciting that there's people that are interested. We had a lot of co-sponsors on these bills. The delegates are interested, and we have to find a way, which is really the hard part of almost all legislation like this, to bridge the gap between the science and the technology and something that we can actually put into practice. So with that, I think I'd conclude and would like to take questions if there's any from anybody.
Yeah, I'm curious about there's been a lot of talk about the false negative pretty much all morning. And I get that, but isn't it better to have something than nothing? Because if you see a kid that has an impact, you shouldn't really be waiting for a sensor to go off. You think that the coaches or the parents who are just watching would see that, oh, that's an impact.
From our perspective, it's a non-issue because parents, teachers, coaches, staff already have the responsibility to take a kid off the field.
It doesn't
who's
mean that you
had
have
an
to take
impact.
them off just because
Right.
the light didn't go off, right? It's just an additional
The
tool.
concern is that people are going to become too reliant on the light, and if the light doesn't go off, they're going to say it's fine. And we're going to have the same problem that we have now where people say, you know, play through it, win the game, do what you have to do. And I can, of course, understand that. But they already have the responsibility to do it. As we said, and we made clear throughout this whole process of this bill, and the manufacturers, I hope, will continue to make clear that it's not a diagnostic procedure. The light doesn't say you have a concussion. It's just a means to say that this student or this athlete should be evaluated. So we don't think it would change the way the game is played. It sounds kind of like a red herring argument for those who don't want to move forward, to me. And that's what we heard that a lot as well.
So what's the incentive to make that argument?
From certain people that we heard, I think that they have a bit of a conflict of interest, and that we heard it from people who, again, have technologies that they're waiting to roll out, they're testing, and they're working out these kinks too. And it's not an illegitimate concern. We want to have the most accurate sensors we can have, but it seemed like a conflict of interest to us. And then a legitimate concern of administration is that people don't, well, no, administrators don't want to have mandates put on them, and we get that too. So that's the balance that we want to try to strike as legislators, getting the technology into schools, whether it's this or anything else, keeping kids safe, versus being fair to administrators like Mr. Sparks and not putting too many demands and burdens on them. So, you know, these are all, I think it's a legitimate concern. And, you know, maybe in the future we will be able to bridge that gap, I think. I don't know. Do you have concerns about false negatives, false positives? And
Yeah, there's some concerns that I know our school people raised about
Right.
the sensors. A couple of them were that, you know, talking about public schools now, all right? Generally speaking, public schools, you know, have provisions in there regarding research on students. You know, basically, this is research. One of the other things that they were also very concerned with was the integrity of the helmet. What happens to the helmet, you know, when you put something on it? Does it void the warranty? Does it void any kind of guarantees that might be there, and so on and so forth regarding the use of a sensor? There is some information out there, and there's an organization called NOCSE, which is the National Operating Committee on Standards of Athletic Equipment, all right, which goes through and talks about, for example, the safety of football helmets, batting helmets, soccer shin guards, and things like that. The information that they put out is a little confusing in regard to add-ons to helmets, all right? And so I think our school people are a little concerned about that. You know, what does that mean? You know, do we need to be into this until the NOCSE folks can approve it, or until we get some kind of a reputable guarantee that what we're doing regarding to putting things on helmets is something that certainly will not be deleterious to the students and so forth. So there are those kind of concerns and thoughts and so forth. I also heard someone say that, you know, why should the public be paying, the public schools and so forth, be paying for somebody's research? You know, and so those were some of the issues that came up in regard and so forth. So those are, you know, you ask for it, and you know,
Yeah.
that's what some of the things that cause it. And not to say that maybe a year from now, and 2 years from now, and 3 years from now, and whatever, you know, that might be the case where, hey, you know, this was laughable, we talked about it this way 3-4 years ago, but now we're all into this, and everything is ready to go. Might be the case. But I think sometimes, you know, change comes a little slow sometimes, and sometimes with, you know, these kind of issues, they're not always as clear as they can be. And like I said earlier, many times the devil is really in the details. And you know, what sounds good when you get into details and so forth doesn't necessarily always, you know, translate into that. Not to say it won't, you know, but we know. And I'm familiar with is it the brain sensor that we're talking about? Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Matter of fact, a college teammate of mine is working with that group. And so, you know, I've known him for 40 years. So, you know, you know, we're certainly very sensitive to it, but at this point in time, I don't know of a school system that would take it on. All right, you know, given the saying, hey, we got this program for you, we're going to give you these sensors. I don't know of a particular school system that would take it on, and that's the issue. Now, private school want to do it, you know, that's a whole different issue and so forth, but I don't know if a public school system would take it on.
So, you get both sides there.
Yeah.
I may have missed this, but are the rules in boys and girls lacrosse different in terms of?
Yeah, boys and girls lacrosse are totally different games. The only thing similar is the name. All right, boys lacrosse is a contact game. You know, they wear the helmets. The helmets are not made for direct contact. They're glancing blows with a stick, with a ball, and so forth. They're not made for, but they're not like a football helmet, but they're certainly very protective. Girls do not wear helmets. All right, their game is more of a finesse game, more of like a basketball, if you will. Although in recent years they've added the goggles, the head goggles for the girls because of any number of injuries to the eye orbits, with getting hit with a ball, and things, broken noses and things of that nature and so forth. So I don't understand girls lacrosse either. I mean, I do understand the passionate. I mean,
Seriously, I'm telling
unbelievable,
you.
passionate for. And I've got 4 daughters, and 2 of them played lacrosse. All right. The response of the embedded lacrosse, girls lacrosse community, women's lacrosse and so forth. I understand, but that's a battle. I mean, those. I mean, unbelievable. Here's the change I think that'll happen with the girls lacrosse, and it's this. Up until, well, through next year, all right, through this year, and then through next year. U.S. lacrosse has been writing rules for girls lacrosse. All right? About 12, 13 years ago, the National Federation took over the rules writing for boys lacrosse. It had grown to such a point across the country and so forth. The National Federation said, hey, we're going to now write rules for boys lacrosse. The National Federation is geared towards a high school student. All right? The National Federation is geared towards the 14 to 18-year-old, and many times playing for the very first time, different levels of ability. You're not talking about a recruited athlete like you have in college. You're not talking about someone who's coming with some skill behind him and things like that and so forth. In 2000, I think it's, I guess, 2016 season, the National Federation will take over writing rules for lacrosse, girls lacrosse. And I could, having been a chairman of committees there, having been on the competition committees there, I can almost assure you that it won't be long before they will put in rules regarding girls lacrosse and the wearing of helmets from a national standard. If and when they do, it's a lot easier for people like me to say, hey, that's the rules. You gotta go by the rules. Those are the games. Their medical folks are suggesting it. We have a good reason to suggest that this would be a very prudent thing to do. We're not going to go against National Federation rules, because
Are you bound by them, though?
no, we're not bound by them. But this is a law school, right? And I don't want to be in a court of law one day, and an attorney say to me, Mr. Sparks, you knew there was a set of rules out there, all right, made for high school kids, made with them in mind, made directly by high school administrators and high school officials and so forth. Why didn't you follow them? I don't have an answer for that one. I just don't have an answer. So we're not bound by them, but we are bound by them.
Right.
Okay, and we play. All of our sports are played under those particular rules, and so we felt like there's safety in that. Kevin, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. I mean, when you're a hammer, the rest of the world is a nail, right? From my perspective, and the type of clinic I run, I don't see the run-of-the-mill concussion. I get the sickest of the sickest make it to me. I can say with a high degree of medical certainty, that some of you are going to hear pretty soon, the vast majority of women's lacrosse players that make it to my clinic have been struck in the head with a stick or a ball. And that is exactly what the helmet is designed for. I don't think those young ladies would have made it to my clinic had they had a hard helmet on.
Should have testified last year.
I've been on the air.
It was
WBAL interviewed me. I've been out in
Well,
the
this
public.
issue's not going away.
Yeah.
as
No,
we
but
know.
I think the reality is, the game is not the same. And to the women who say it's the same, they changed the dynamic of the game when they went from a wooden stick with catgut to nylon. The ball travels faster. I don't believe they can throw the ball the same speed with the stick that they did the wooden stick. It's slower with the wooden stick. The ball is traveling faster. We are seeing far more, and I was an athletic trainer in college, we are seeing many more concussions in women's lacrosse with the newer equipment than we ever saw with the old equipment. And whoever says otherwise is crazy.
What about the argument that they'll be more aggressive?
They're already more aggressive, because what happened was, as more girls played the game, they didn't have enough women who had played the game before coaching, and the men started coaching the women. So you know what happens when you got dads volunteering in youth girls lacrosse? They're putting in some of the guys' habits into the game. It's already there.
we had observed, but
Well, you're right.
other folks did not agree.
Then
Well,
have them come spend time with me in the clinic.
Yeah,
That would be eye-opening, I'm sure.
we just kind of sat back and watched that fight, because we've
It was.
we've
it
been
was
down that
something.
road, and we know what it is.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
A question that sort of follows up on that, but also was kind of implicit in the first question I was asking, which is, when you made your recommendations, how kind of, evidence-based were they? I mean, for example, I'll just give you an example. I was a swimmer, and to call something a non-contact sport is to look at the competition, not at the workouts, where backstrokers are constantly
Hitting the wall.
hitting the wall or colliding with each other in mid-lap. But yes, hitting the wall is a more serious impact, especially for inexperienced high school swimmers who didn't come from an age group swimming background. So these are things that you wouldn't necessarily think about or know unless you had people involved in the sport. So I'm thinking about kind of anecdotal evidence, but I'm also thinking about kind of empirical evidence, looking at different populations of athletes and wondering how much of that made its way into your recommendations. I tend to look at things from a public health point of view.
Well, let me tell you, we stole that contact collision from the National Pediatric Association. That's not, maybe not the right name of their group, but it's physicians, pediatric.
We had sports medicine physicians, some of the top trainers in the state. We had a lot of good people in the room specifically looking at that issue.
Really?
You know, I've seen concussions in every sport. You name it, I can tell you how a kid has had a concussion in that sport, including cross-country.
Sure. Falls down, trips over a
He
root, whatever.
hit
Yeah.
a tree root with his head. Okay? I've had tennis players get concussions because they slip on their sweat on the court and whack their head on the court.
Going
Okay?
to the
I
post.
had an Olympic swimmer who, in the pool when they're all swimming around doing warm-up, swam full speed into another swimmer. It happens in every sport. The question is it a design of the sport to get hit? Is it incidental, or is it rare? And I think that's where we really started
Yeah.
splitting the hairs, because the mandate came down that we were supposed to reduce the risk at practice. Well, it's ludicrous to say, okay, in cross-country, you're not allowed to run by trees. But limiting the number of hitting practices in football, lacrosse made sense, and when you look at soccer, there are crazy coaches out there, and I coach soccer, there are crazy coaches out there that make kids head the ball for 15 minutes straight. That's just ridiculous. Okay? So, we had to curb the crazy coach behavior and do it in a reasonable manner. So we had a ton of good people in the room
Okay.
that have lived athletic, coaches, ADs, some of the best trainers in the state.
Okay.
And some of these trainers are smarter than some of the doctors I
That's a
work
good
with.
answer. Well, then,
So,
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, Dr. Crutchfield, you were involved in the conversation when developing this, this information about the recommendations?
Yes.
Just in terms of distinguishing, I don't see any language just about, freshman sports, and I know you had touched upon it earlier in your presentation, about the age difference and how the brain develops differently based on age. I mean, as you said, there's a difference between, a ninth grader in high school and then a senior in high school. Was that ever part of the conversation about developing guidelines that might take that into account? That maybe a varsity athlete might be better suited to handle some of these hits than, let's say, a freshman athlete?
That question's probably better directed to Mr. Sparks, because he will tell you how onerous it is to come up with standards that meet everyone. And that is splitting hairs at such a fine degree, we are never gonna get down to that kind of detail.
You could have a freshman playing on the varsity.
Or you could have a six-year senior who's 25.
Sure, I'm thinking you could, but I
Not
mean,
now,
generally
I hope
speaking,
not.
I think to play an 18-year-old wouldn't be normally on a freshman team, unless I went to high school, I never saw any 18-year-olds on freshman teams, but, majority are still developing, and I know that, just in terms of workouts, at least at the high school that I attended, it was not encouraged to, overstrain freshman athletes. I think that they gave a lot of latitude for the older the varsity students. They said, you're allowed to work out a little bit more, or we'd encourage you to, not necessarily encourage, but they recognized that younger athletes were still developing. Obviously this is outside of concussions, but just in general, their bodies were developing. So I
Again,
mean,
a good coach is gonna know that already, but it's so hard to mandate that. That's next to impossible. I mean, it was hard enough to get out there in a manner that made a difference, what we got out there. And what wasn't mentioned this morning is that each state's concussion law is implemented via different vehicles. In Maryland, it's Department of Education. In New Jersey, it's Department of Medicine, Health and Hygiene. So the laws are written different depending on who has to implement the laws. In Maryland, it's education because it was all about educating about concussions, which is why we're struggling with what are the requirements for the clinicians, but that's not the jurisdiction of education to mandate what are the qualifications of physicians to determine who has a concussion or not. New Jersey, coming through medicine, that was their primary goal, was, okay, we're gonna have a concussion law, but we're gonna really tightly regulate the types of people who are allowed to manage concussion. That's not what Mr. Sparks does. That's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene looking at licensure and credentialing of physicians, and that's up to each physician community, what is the standard of care in the community to police themselves on who's really qualified to make these decisions in returning the kid to go back in and play. And I can guarantee you, a family practice doctor who doesn't see the number of brain injuries I do in my community, who thinks they're gonna get in court and sit across from me as a equally qualified expert in brain injury, is smoking crack. They really are.
just about education, do you think from either of the speakers that the education that's been provided so far has had an effect on, people? Obviously, there's still a degree of reservation from, obviously a lot of constituents are saying, we don't want to see helmets in women's lacrosse. Do you think the education is working to inform them about the concussion?
The answer to your question is twofold. I think that anecdotally, let me give you the anecdotal thing. 11-year-old grandchild, right? Got a granddaughter, and a little bit of a drama queen, all right? A little bit of a hypochondriac, he's 11 years old and so forth. And my daughter, her mother, said to me, she says, the worst thing they ever did was this concussion awareness. Every 5 minutes she's got a concussion. Now, that at least tells me, that, all right, here's an 11-year-old knows about it. Obviously, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, a kid that age wouldn't have any idea what you were talking about. So at least, it's out there and kids are aware of it, and obviously parents are aware of it. And when my daughter talks to me, she's saying in a little bit of a joking manner, but she says, this kid's got a concussion every 5 minutes, and obviously not the case, and so that's just from an anecdotal point of view. So that just tells me that, hey, there's an awful lot of people out there that have their awarenesses tremendously raised. Now, is there the problem where kids don't report it? I might not have reported it, I'm okay, I didn't mean that. So kids might not report it. And, hey, that means I got to come out of the game. That means I can't play next week. That means we got the the big game is next week. That means a coach from such and such college is going to come look at me this game, and I got to be in the game. Otherwise, that might diminish my chances. All right, all those kind of things, and plus the fact, the overall feeling of young people, anyways, is that they're invincible. That nothing's going to happen to them, and they're going to live forever. And I hope you do, but that's not the case. So, yes, there's been changes. Is it completely gone away? No, it won't. And I don't know if it ever will. How many people, adults, deny something that they have wrong with them, and it turns into something serious, and pretty soon it's too late? How many people? I mean, you all know cases like that. Maybe even people that or relatives or things like that. I'm never going to the doctor, and so on and so forth for this or for that. And then what happens? All of a sudden, you get down the road, and it's too late. The damage has been done, and it's irreversible. And now you just it's something. So it's human nature, I think, too. But I think that it's something that certainly is vast improved. And there's no question about that what you see on television, you know, with the NFL and even with Major League Baseball and things like that and so forth, with the steps that are being made and the seriousness that it happens to take in. I just think that we're much better off than we were. Will we ever be perfect? No. All right. Will kids still get concussions? Yeah. All right. But hopefully we can reduce that and reduce some of the tragic things that potentially could happen.
I don't have any data that you don't have, but I think the fact that we're here and having discussions like this means that people are taking notice. And folks that are coaching sports now, a lot of them weren't raised on this type of education, so I think you'll have changing attitudes as people get older and new coaches come in and things of that nature. But we probably will always have the problem to some extent.
I have a question. So one of the things we talked a lot today with unintended consequences. One of the things that I've just observed the past couple of years being involved with this is an unintended consequence of education. Is that the kids who feel gung-ho to play, they now know that if they come out and say something, that they're going to be taken out.
Mhm.
So it seems to be that they're less likely to acknowledge some of these issues.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess maybe the next part of that education would be, all right, if you don't say something, here are the serious ramifications that can happen. And maybe that hasn't quite got there. You haven't gotten to that level yet. You know, saying, hey, if you don't say something, you know, this could happen to you, or this happened to someone someplace else, and think about that and so forth. But again, there's always that denial.
There's the same problem in the military with concussions, because soldiers want to go back and be with their buddies on the front line. They don't want to be pulled out of duty. So they instituted something that we're trying and working on getting into the NFL. It's a concussion buddy system. You're also responsible for the guy with you. But the one thing the military has that we all, and will never have in the civilian sector, and that's a chain of accountability. So if your soldier is blown up and the concussion doesn't go reported, that soldier's squad leader is responsible. The company commander who's in charge of that squad leader is also accountable. And that accountability goes all the way up to the general in theater, who's accountable for every soldier on the battlefield's concussion. So when you start to have the chain of accountability, and that's sort of what I alluded to earlier today when I said the law doesn't have teeth, is there's no chain of accountability. As long as there will remain no chain of accountability, you're not going to make a substantial change in the attitudes of how this is addressed. So who's accountable? Well, we're somewhat making the coaches and athletic directors accountable, which is why they're getting on board and doing the mandatory education. But, you know, without accountability, there will not be 100% compliance for sure.
We're talking about minors. Wouldn't the parents be accountable at the end of the day?
Sometimes they're the problem. I had a 10-year-old on his 10th concussion. His mom and dad kept putting him back on the ice playing hockey.
And
You want that parent in charge of that child?
I mean, isn't there like some child protective service or something?
Yeah, there is. But where do you draw?
I can't see
But,
job
but,
protectors.
I mean, if the kid came in and had bruises all over his body, I could call them, but when it's sports related,
That one would be fun.
when do you draw the line? I mean, with that kid, if they didn't pull that kid out, I was tempted to call Child Protective Services. But where do you draw the line? Then they don't come back, then they go to the next physician down the road, and they doctor shop until they get Dr. Yes to say yes to everything that the parents want. Okay, that's why we have antibiotic-resistant bacteria now, because every child got put on antibiotics because the parents asked for them, whether they had a bacterial infection or a viral infection. And if you didn't give them the antibiotics, they went to the next pediatrician down the road, and you lost the business. That's happening too. They doctor shot. Now, the law somewhat didn't have enough teeth in it the way I wanted it in Maryland, because we had to make a lot of people happy. But, you know, we tried to stop the doctor shopping through the language. Because what was happening is I was telling kids, as a brain injury expert, they shouldn't play. Mom would go home to the dermatologist who popped zits all day and get them to sign off to kick and play because they had MD after their name. And they were allowed to play with a brain injury that the zit doctor cleared them. And that's happening. Not happening now because the way the law is written, and as I understood it, and I backed off, because the way it's written, open-ended, is open to interpretation. And every lawyer I've talked to loves things written with open interpretation. They can litigate it to death. Am I right?
Well, it's about time for us to start heading over for the final panel today. I'd like to thank the speakers for giving us their education.